Operational urgency is something that comes up over and over again across all our research in CETaS, the more that we speak to the people on the front line, the practitioners. So very powerful words. Thank you so much, Gavin. Our next panel, our fifth panel today, is on generative AI and national security. This report has gained so much attention. It's possibly like the most comprehensive report on the implications of generative AI for the national security community. And it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists, which include Ardi Janjeva, Research Associate at CETaS, Professor Alexander Kasprzyk from Nottingham University, Anna Gausen from Imperial College London, and they will be moderated by Rosamund Powell, who's a research associate at CETaS.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you to all of our panelists today. I think almost every panel we've had today has mentioned generative AI in some capacity, but this is the first one to focus on it explicitly. I know there's a lot of content to cover in this one, so I'm going to hand straight over to Ardi Janjeva to share a bit more about the research. Over to you.
Yeah, so I'm going to do a little bit more of an in-depth presentation compared to some of the other panels that we've had today, just to really reflect the fact that it was around this time last year that we knew we wanted to pursue a project looking at the implications of generative AI for national security and try and make sense of all the noise and the hype that was going around, and in doing so, speak to as wide a range of people as possible and get a sense of what those implications are. And that involved talking to over 50 different experts from academia, government, both here and abroad, civil society and industry as well. I'll start off with some of the key points before going through our main findings in a bit more detail. First, the rise of generative AI, I think, has been a perfect encapsulation, really, of how technology is continually stretching our definition of national security. AI moving from something that only experts with years of experience and PhDs dealt with to being something that really was at the fingertips of any member of the population, potentially. And that brings with it a set of threat vectors which may not really have been imaginable before. But the point on the screen also about augmentation of pre-existing societal risks, and I think this was mentioned earlier as well, is a very important one. There are, I'd say, very few brand new risks that this technology is bringing to the table, and the implication there is that we don't need to kind of throw everything out the window when we're thinking about mitigations and how we respond to some of this. In terms of how the national security community uses these tools, we had a very good panel earlier with Adam and Rich, and there are certainly opportunities, as they outline, but in kind of concurring with what they were saying, the evidence that we also found was that they are ultimately still too unreliable to be trusted in the highest stakes context, in national security. I think a useful way of thinking about this is that for an attacker, the inherent unreliability of these tools isn't really a massive problem, because you can kind of throw 1,000 darts at a problem and you only really need one to land and go through. The cost of failure is pretty low if 999 don't land. But from a defensive point of view, incorporating a tool into your process which you don't fully trust, it only takes one error, one mishap, for something to slip through the net and go terribly wrong. So there's a fundamentally different risk calculation from attack and defense there. And as well as thinking about how generative AI will augment intentionally malicious actors, there will need to be enough of a pivot within the national security community to account for all the incidental risks posed by the use of this technology and potential unintended consequences emerging from that. Because for decades, the national security community has been built to anticipate an adversary that they can identify, work to understand how they operate, understand their tradecraft, and counter them on that basis. But I think what the global spread of AI is telling us is that knowing where the next threat is coming from, who it's being perpetrated by, and what their intentions are is becoming more and more difficult. And that potentially increases the scope for miscalculations as well. The upshot of all this, and going back to the very first panel of the day, is that governments need to keep, improving their visibility and understanding over these technologies, championing best practices across different communities, and keeping on pushing, establishing incentives and regulation. The history of AI is filled with hype, overpromises, letdowns. I think Al might touch on some of that in his comments as well. And some people have viewed the current explosion of interest in generative AI as a continuation of that pattern. But there are many ways in which generative AI does represent a genuine step change in what's possible using AI. Previously, you'd have a team of experts who would create a specific task-based tool, whether that's route mapping or spell checking, for non-expert users, and they could pretty much effectively set the bounds of what those users could go away and use that tool for. But I think with generative AI, users have far more control over how that technology is used, and that can result in applications which creators wouldn't initially have even thought of. The greater level of creativity and freedom that we see with this technology is pretty well encapsulated in the way that open source has also exploded. Within this research, we looked at malicious AI risks through the lens of threats to political, digital, and physical security. And the effect of generative AI on political security is obviously a question top of the list for many governments around the world. All the elections taking place this year alone, we all know about. And because of how high the stakes were, we really did think that it was important to start developing a better framework to understand how the different types of actors, their intent, the level of danger posed, and mitigation against undesirable applications all relates to this question. And, I think this diagram is quite interesting in showing that even within the same category of actor, there will be different intentions at play, and that can lead to different levels of risk. For example, you might have a hostile state actor who may have the goal of directly interfering in domestic politics or the voting process. One could imagine on election day in marginal seats, voters receive AI-enabled voice calls or network-style messages telling them that voting stations have closed or have been moved or closed that day. On the other hand, the state actor might be focused on just pursuing traditional stratcom goals and achieving impact by poisoning the public debate, things like creating deepfake interviews with high-profile political candidates or deepfakes of news presenters and anchors reporting inaccurate developments. So really breaking this down across those 4 different areas is going to be increasingly important as we get to grips with what this means for our democracies, essentially. And just to go back to this very quickly, I think generally speaking, it's important to place the emphasis on the combination of generative text, image, video, audio as part of a larger operation. Those modalities in combination cumulatively exceeding the individual impact of any one of those modalities on their own. In the cybersecurity context, the way that generative AI assists much less technically competent users is especially clear, and this has come up a couple of times today already. Working with a generative AI tool as a teammate, a malicious actor may need less time to develop a capable attack or to find an effective way to inject a prompt with malicious instructions. But then if you consider fraud, there's a slightly different angle here where generative AI may be more useful for the more professional-looking and highly targeted fraud attempts. And that's where the ability of generative AI tools to respond to messages in context, adopt specific writing styles, can be particularly important in enhancing quality. And this has come up also today, that the proliferation of AI-generated child sexual abuse material is a significant concern for law enforcement agencies. And again, that difficulty of distinguishing real from fake is going to continue to increase, pose the challenge of false negatives slipping through the net, and also false positives as well, taking up valuable law enforcement resource. The final threat category that we looked at is the risk to physical security. So, first, that risk that generative AI may help malicious actors gain easy access to the information necessary to build weapons and execute attack plans. But here we did also note that there are significant leaps in capability and capacity that are required, which an AI model itself may not necessarily be able to help with. And secondly, we also need to really be monitoring the ways that generative AI could be used for the purpose of radicalization and terrorism as well. The personalized relationships that individuals can now form with AI chatbots, in part due to their constant availability, timeless patience, they're there 24/7 if you need them, that can alter the way that radicalization is potentially done in future. But at the moment, there is still that kind of distinctly human aspect to that process, which the current generation of generative AI tools are going to be unlikely to replicate anytime soon. I'll just pause on these two graphics here, just to draw attention to what I was saying at the beginning around incidental risks and some important distinctions. That pyramid on the left, I think, gives quite a broad characterization of the source of the threat and how it's linked to willingness to do harm. So when we're talking about malicious actors, that willingness is obviously pretty high, but that may be divided across different types of actors, whether that's organized adversaries, which themselves are then split from hostile state actors to organized crime groups potentially, and then also maybe lone actors who might be working from their bedroom. And then that's what leads you into the triangle on the right-hand side, the different contexts in which improper use of AI systems rather than malicious use can lead to significant harms. And the context there range from critical national infrastructure to public services to the private sector and what we call DIY experimentation. And that is likely to need to trigger a shift in mindset across the national security community. I will skip this because of time, and I think Adam and Rich covered this off well enough, but maybe something to return to in the Q&A on intelligence applications. And just a final slide here on governance and policy. Obviously, to respond to that pretty complex landscape, governments need to develop policy interventions which have those goals of creating better visibility and understanding of advanced AI systems, champion best practices, and establishing appropriate incentives and regulation. And it's been a very busy year for governance and policy proposals, and we discussed those in the first panel. And the way we kind of characterized it is that some approaches are going to involve AI developers and their tools signaling to government and relevant bodies. So we see this through kind of provenance. The provenance of a piece of content can be signaled through approaches like watermarking, which take place at the point of content generation, whereas other approaches will signal provenance after a piece of content has been created and disseminated, and that's what many AI detection tools claim to do. But for both of those examples, watermarking, AI detection, clear doubts relating to either their ability to be resistant to tampering or just their accuracy in general. And that might partly be why we've seen reporting mechanisms gain a lot more traction lately. Lots of resources are being poured into the evaluation of the safety of advanced AI systems, and relying on companies to report the results of that to government as a way of containing risk. And just on that, I think this is something that Anna will touch on a little bit more as well. But our argument here was essentially that to understand the full spectrum of national security implications, AI system evaluation is really going to have to go beyond just the capabilities of any one individual model. And that's where a multi-layered socio-technical approach to system evaluation is going to be especially important to understand how human interactions and different systemic factors throughout society interact with the technical components of the model itself. And then finally, again, touched on red lines at the very beginning of today, but governments are also going to have to go a step beyond signaling and reporting mechanisms and decide where they need to implement stricter measures and where integrating AI into decision-making is going to be undesirable for the foreseeable future. I think these are just some broader points around responsible innovation and deployment, which I think I can leave on the slide for people to ponder for a little bit. That's the presentation, and look forward to getting into the questions.
Thank you, Ardi. As with all the panels today, we will take questions at the end. I want to maximize time for that, so do submit them via Slido now if you have them. In the meantime, I'm going to turn to you, Alex, first. And my own academic background is in the history of AI, so I've always been quite interested in why forecasts on how AI is going to progress in the future have been so bad and so overly optimistic. So my question for you is, why should we believe forecasts now which tell us progress is going to carry on as it has in the last 2 years? and what might you anticipate for the future?
Okay, thanks very much. I mean, part of my answer is it really true that progress in AI was so poor until very recently? I think it wasn't. You know, there was a lot of really great work done with expert systems that found themselves embedded in modern technology. We use this technology now kind of without appreciating that it is classical AI. You know, the problem was the maybe misunderstanding the complexity of the problems that people wanted to solve. So they were overhyping and overselling what would be possible without really the evidence in place to support these claims. And that eventually backfired, especially when it came to natural language processing. So now we're in a slightly different situation. You know, we have these large language models in generative AI more generally, which is demonstrating that we can make significant steps towards doing natural language processing, something that we never saw before through expert systems and approaches which were more sort of computationally based. Okay. So why is it probably not hype this time? Well, because we have the evidence in front of us. You know, you load up ChatGPT and you see it's working for you. Okay? So, you know, what do we see for the future? Well, you know, the question is, there's some hype built into large language models. You know, we're expecting them to be reasoning, well, not necessarily the audience, but the public expects them to be reasoning. They ask them questions. If we're going to start using large language models and generative AI in policy making, you know, we're going to be asking it questions. We're going to be expecting well-reasoned, logical outputs, and there's no evidence that that's really happening. That's not how large language models are designed. So there's a potential hurdle over the horizon that may it may end up being similar to what we experience with expert systems, but you know, for now at least, we've got technology that does something. It does something very well. So it's just about understanding the limits of the technology.
Interesting, and definitely, yeah, really interesting to consider whether it was they weren't achieving what they aimed or they miscommunicated that to the public and the public expected more from them. And if I can come to you next, Ardi mentioned in the report that you have a specific approach to evaluating AI systems as both socio-technical and multi-layered. Would you expand on what that actually looks like in practice and means for a government audience?
Yeah, so first I can talk about evaluation itself as an approach. So I think it's one of the most valuable tools that we have right now to understand the current state of our models and understand that the risks that they introduce. So the one thing that's worth saying is evaluation on its own won't necessarily help us address risks, but it helps us understand them. And then that works as a crucial first step towards more research, intervention, regulation. Evaluation can take a few different forms. So the most broad form would be automated test suites. We run automated tests on models to understand their capabilities. Another type of evaluation that would be more specific to a certain area of interest would be red teaming. So you bring in subject matter experts and get them to interact with the system and see if they can overcome its safeguards, for example, or get it to do some malicious use case that it maybe shouldn't be able to. And the other thing we can do is human studies. So that's when you bring in a group of people to interact with the model to try and understand questions like, do people trust these systems? Can they form relationships with them? Can the systems change people's views on things? So the other question then is, how do we go about evaluation? It's obviously this very broad thing. And there was a survey at the end of last year by DeepMind that looked at surveying safety evaluations of generative AI. And they basically found that most evaluations at that point were model-centric. And what I mean by model-centric, and Ardi touched on this, is evaluations that focus on specific model technical capabilities in isolation. But as we've discussed all day, national security risks are very complex and high level, and that type of evaluation just isn't sufficient. So in this paper, we really promote approaching evaluation from a multi-layer perspective that considers the full socio-technical system. So we obviously want to think about the technical system, but we also want to think about how it interacts with the social system in which it's deployed with them. So just to illustrate it a bit more, in the paper we have an example, which is guidance on how you might evaluate risk to political disinformation. And I can just briefly touch on what you might think about evaluating at each level, just one example. So if we think about model capability layer, the technical model capability, we might be interested in understanding, okay, are these models capable of developing audio, visual, textual content for political disinformation campaigns. And then when we think of the next level, human interaction, we might start thinking about, okay, are people persuaded by this AI-generated content? Can they differentiate between AI-generated content and human-generated content? And then at the systemic level, we would think about how factors such as model availability, model cost, is the model open source, how that interacts with the other layers of risk. And I hope that gives you a bit more of an understanding of why it's so important to think about evaluation at these multiple layers and how that's the only way that we can get to a really robust and comprehensive understanding of the risks posed by these systems.
That's a really useful account of that and one of the best explained versions I've heard in a while. And also really useful to start it out by saying evaluation doesn't address the risks on its own. Regulation and governance are needed. And I think we'll come to that in the questions. There's one final aspect of the report I don't think we've touched on yet, and Ardi, perhaps if we could do it quite quickly, is what you discuss about autonomous agents and synthetic societies and why that's a particular theme national security should be paying attention to.
Yeah, so as quickly as I can, autonomous agents in terms of when we ask what's new, we had a bit in the report which my co-author was mainly led on, which was essentially looking at what this synergy of the large language model and the agent means. And essentially you've got kind of an agent enhancing the capabilities of a large language model, whilst the large language model benefits from the adaptive nature of an agent framework. And that can give the system more autonomy and dynamic planning. So just to give some examples, we had positive and negative scenarios here. So in a positive scenario, you could have a simulated team of language agent analysts, each specialized in a particular area of intelligence. So you might have an agent which is specialized in cyber threats, another which is specialized in kind of counterterrorism, geopolitical assessments. These agents could rapidly be processing vast amounts of open source intelligence, preparing preliminary risk assessments, generating hypotheses for human analysts to review and validate. And they can run 24/7 for continuous monitoring and timely response to emerging situations. And then there are various kind of specific kind of operational examples that you could put them to there. Then on the flipping the script a little bit, there are also some kind of more concerning use cases too, and we explored these in 2 case studies which my colleague Sarah wrote about in the report. And just touch on one of these case studies, we ran a case study where an agent was tasked with performing very targeted open source intelligence gathering on a potential target of interest, so compiling a dossier basically, building that dossier on an individual and then allowing the user to kind of ask questions of that, give it commands such as writing a phishing email tailored to that individual based on the dossier that they've collected. And the results were concerning in some respects, in that no coding skills were really required for the user to run that whole thing, essentially. The results that were surfaced in the dossier were pretty current, even though it still did make, again, some of those reasoning errors that a human analyst simply wouldn't have. But in terms of gathering sources to create that initial draft of a dossier, and you could imagine all the kind of security context where that might be quite interesting and harmful, we demonstrate that there was some utility there. So it's going to be an accelerating force, both positively and negatively, and there needs to be a lot more research there.